The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 1,000th time that year. At 32 years old, he had spent nearly a decade standing motionless as a Queen's Guard, his face an expressionless mask beneath the iconic bearskin hat. He prided himself on his unwavering composure, having endured tourists poking him, children making faces, and even birds landing on his rifle without so much as a twitch. James had grown up in a small village in Yorkshire, where his grandfather had filled his childhood with stories of serving the royal family. Those tales had sparked a dream that eventually led him to this prestigious position. His training had been rigorous, teaching him to become a living statue, immune to all distractions and emotions while on duty. The Queen's Guards were symbols of British tradition and discipline, and James wore that responsibility like armor. On this particular Tuesday in October, something felt different in the air. Palace staff moved with unusual urgency, and whispered conversations floated through the corridors. James had heard rumors that a special visitor was expected, but royal schedules were often kept confidential from the guards. His duty was simple: stand at his post by the main entrance, remain absolutely still, and protect the royal family with his life if necessary. The first sign that this day would be unlike any other came when a modest black car pulled up to the palace gates instead of the usual royal motorcade. James watched from the corner of his eye as palace officials hurried to greet whoever was inside. His curiosity piqued when he saw a small figure emerge from the vehicle, but his training kept his gaze fixed straight ahead. What James couldn't see was the remarkable story unfolding just yards away from his post. The passenger in that black car was 8-year-old Emma Thompson, a brave little girl who had captured the nation's heart through her battle with leukemia. For the past 2 years, Emma had undergone countless chemotherapy sessions, spending more days in hospital beds than playing in parks. Despite her illness, she had maintained an infectious smile and had even started a charity drive to help other sick children. Emma's story had reached the royal family through a letter she had written to the Queen. In her careful, childish handwriting, she hadn't asked for anything for herself. Instead, she had requested that the Queen help other children who were fighting serious illnesses like her own. The letter was filled with spelling mistakes and decorated with crayon drawings of crowns and castles, but its sincerity had moved everyone who read it. The Queen, known for her composed demeanor and formal protocol, had been deeply touched by Emma's selfless request. She had immediately arranged for this private meeting, wanting to honor the little girl's courage and discuss her charitable ideas. The palace staff had worked tirelessly to ensure everything would be perfect for Emma's visit, from arranging her favorite biscuits to having a special chair brought in that would be the right height for her small frame. As James maintained his rigid stance, he began to hear soft voices approaching his position. The sound of small footsteps mixed with the click of adult shoes on the stone pathway. He fought the urge to look, knowing that breaking protocol could result in serious consequences. The Queen's Guards were expected to remain focused on their duties regardless of what happened around them. But then he heard something that made his heart skip a beat. A tiny voice, weakened by months of medical treatment but filled with wonder, whispered, "Mummy, look at the soldier. He's so tall and brave, just like in my storybooks." The voice was followed by a gentle shush from what James assumed was the child's mother, probably worried about disturbing the guard's concentration. James had encountered thousands of children during his years of service. They often tried to make him laugh or react, treating him like a living toy rather than a person doing an important job. He had learned to tune out their chatter and games, focusing instead on scanning for potential threats and maintaining the dignity of his position. Children's voices had become background noise to him, no more significant than the sound of traffic or birds chirping. However, something about this particular voice was different. There was a quality to it that he couldn't quite identify at first. It wasn't the playful tone of a tourist's child or the demanding voice of a spoiled youngster. This voice carried weight that seemed impossible for someone so young. It held a mixture of wonder, gratitude, and something else that James would later recognize as the wisdom that comes from facing life's hardest challenges at an impossibly young age. The footsteps stopped directly in front of James's position. He could sense people standing just a few feet away, and he knew they were looking at him. His training kicked in automatically, and he straightened his already perfect posture even more. Every muscle in his body was tense, with the effort of maintaining absolute stillness while his mind raced with curiosity about the visitors. The child's mother spoke in hushed tones, explaining to her daughter that the guards were working and couldn't talk or move while on duty. She described their important job of protecting the Queen and how they trained for years to develop such incredible discipline. James appreciated her respectful explanation, which was more considerate than many visitors showed. Then the little girl asked a question that would haunt James for the rest of his life. "Mummy, do you think the soldier knows that some children never get to grow up to be brave like him?" The innocence in her voice was heartbreaking, but it was the profound understanding behind her words that truly shook James to his core. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. James felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the armor he had built around his emotions. He had never considered his role from that perspective before. To him, being a Queen's Guard was a job, an honor, and a tradition. But to this child, he represented something much more significant. The promise of growing up, of becoming strong, of having a future to work toward. The mother's voice became even softer as she responded to her daughter's question. "I think he knows that being brave isn't about being big and strong, sweetheart. I think he knows that the bravest people are often the smallest ones, who keep smiling even when things are very difficult." James felt his throat tighten as he realized this wasn't just any sick child visiting the palace. This was someone special, someone whose story had clearly moved the royal family enough to arrange a personal audience. As the group prepared to move toward the palace entrance, James heard the little girl whisper one final comment that would change everything. "I hope when I get better, I can be strong enough to protect people too, just like him." The pure hope in her voice, combined with the underlying acknowledgement that getting better wasn't guaranteed, created a perfect storm of emotion that James's professional training couldn't withstand. For the first time in his career as a Queen's Guard, James felt tears forming in his eyes. They started as a slight burning sensation that he tried to blink away, but the emotional impact of the child's words continued to build inside him like pressure in a steam kettle. He thought about his own childhood, his dreams of serving his country, and the assumption he had always made that growing up was simply something that happened to everyone. The tears began to flow despite his desperate efforts to maintain control. They rolled down his cheeks silently, hidden partially by the shadow of his bearskin hat but visible to anyone who looked closely. James had never felt so exposed or so human while in uniform. Every instinct told him to stop, to regain his composure, to remember his duty. But the tears seemed to have a life of their own, flowing from a place deeper than his professional training could reach. What James didn't know was that palace staff had witnessed his emotional moment and immediately understood its significance. Rather than reprimanding him for breaking protocol, they recognized that he had just experienced something extraordinary. His reaction would soon become part of a larger story about the power of innocence to touch even the most disciplined hearts. The little girl and her family disappeared into the palace, leaving James alone with his thoughts and his tears. He stood there for the remaining 2 hours of his shift, processing what had just happened and trying to understand why a few simple words from a child had affected him so profoundly. He realized that in all his years of guarding the royal family, he had never truly understood what he was protecting until that moment. As his replacement arrived to take over the post, James walked away from his position with a new understanding of his role and a story that would soon spread far beyond the palace walls. He had no idea that his moment of vulnerability would become a symbol of hope and humanity that would touch millions of people around the world. The day that had started like any other had become a turning point, not just for James, but for everyone who would eventually hear about the guard who cried for a brave little girl who dreamed of growing up to protect others. Sometimes the most powerful moments in life come from the most unexpected sources, and sometimes the strongest people are those who aren't afraid to show their hearts. 3 months after James Mitchell's emotional encounter, another extraordinary moment was unfolding at Windsor Castle during the Christmas season. The ancient walls were decorated with festive garlands, and the winter air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke from the massive fireplaces inside. For Corporal Sarah Davies, this was supposed to be just another ceremonial duty during the holiday period, but fate had different plans. Sarah had joined the Queen's Guard only 18 months earlier, making her one of the few women to hold this prestigious position. At 26, she brought a different perspective to the role, having previously served as a medic in Afghanistan. Her military background had taught her to compartmentalize emotions and focus on the mission, skills that translated perfectly to the stoic requirements of Royal Guard duty. She had fought hard to earn respect from her male colleagues and had never once allowed personal feelings to interfere with her professional responsibilities. The December morning was crisp and clear as Sarah took her position outside the castle's main entrance. Christmas was just a week away, and the royal family was preparing for their traditional holiday celebrations. The grounds were busier than usual, with staff preparing for various events and visits from dignitaries. Sarah had been briefed about a special ceremony planned for that afternoon, but the details had been kept deliberately vague. What Sarah didn't know was that the royal family had arranged a very special Christmas surprise. After the success of little Emma Thompson's visit, the Queen had decided to invite several children from local hospitals and care facilities to participate in a holiday celebration at the castle. These weren't ordinary children making a typical royal visit. These were young people facing serious challenges who had shown remarkable courage and strength in their daily lives. Among the invited children was 10-year-old Michael Roberts, a boy who had been born with cerebral palsy and had spent his entire life in a wheelchair. Despite his physical limitations, Michael had an incredibly bright spirit and had recently gained attention for creating a charity that collected used wheelchairs to refurbish and donate to children in developing countries. His motto was "Wheels of Hope," and he had already helped dozens of children gain mobility they never could have afforded otherwise. Michael's story was particularly touching because he never saw his wheelchair as a limitation. Instead, he viewed it as his superpower, allowing him to move quickly and efficiently while helping others. His positive attitude had inspired his entire community, and his charity work had caught the attention of several celebrities and politicians. The Queen had personally requested that Michael be included in the Christmas celebration after reading about his selfless work. As the afternoon ceremony began, Sarah maintained her rigid posture while watching a steady stream of children, families, and caregivers arrive at the castle. Each child had a unique story of overcoming adversity, but they all shared a common thread of resilience and hope that was immediately apparent to anyone who met them. The atmosphere was filled with excitement and joy, creating a stark contrast to the formal, controlled environment Sarah was accustomed to during royal duties. The children were given a tour of the castle's public rooms, where they saw priceless artwork, historical artifacts, and the famous Christmas tree that stood nearly 20 feet tall in the main hall. Their gasps of wonder and excited chatter created a warmth that seemed to fill every corner of the ancient building. Even the usually reserved palace staff found themselves smiling as they watched the children's reactions to the magical surroundings. After the tour, the Queen herself appeared to meet with each child individually. These weren't formal, protocol-heavy meetings. but genuine conversations where she asked about their interests, their families, and their dreams for the future. The Queen, despite her advanced age and decades of formal training, had always had a special gift for connecting with children. She spoke to them as equals, showing genuine interest in their thoughts and opinions. Michael had been saving his conversation with the Queen for last, wanting to personally thank her for supporting his charity work. When his turn finally arrived, he wheeled himself up to where she was sitting with the confidence of someone much older than his 10 years. His mother walked beside him, beaming with pride at her son's poise and maturity. What happened next would become one of the most powerful moments in royal history. Instead of the formal greeting everyone expected, Michael asked if he could show the Queen something special. When she nodded, he reached into a bag attached to his wheelchair and pulled out a small handmade wooden toy car that he had crafted himself in his school's woodworking class. The toy car was simple but beautifully made, painted in bright red with tiny working wheels that actually turned. Michael had spent weeks creating it, working extra hours after school to get every detail perfect. But the most remarkable thing about the gift wasn't its craftsmanship, it was what it represented. Michael explained that he had made the car for the Queen because he wanted her to have something that could move freely, just like he hoped all children could someday. The Queen accepted the gift with visible emotion, turning the little car over in her hands and examining every detail. She asked Michael about the process of making it, showing genuine fascination with his explanation of the tools and techniques he had used. For several minutes, the formal atmosphere of the royal meeting dissolved, as two people simply shared a moment of human connection over a handmade toy. But the most touching moment was yet to come. As Michael prepared to leave, he looked up at the Queen with serious eyes and said, "Your Majesty, I know you have lots of important things to do, but I want you to know that you make children like me feel special. When people see that you care about us, it makes them care too. Thank you for helping me help other kids." The sincerity and wisdom in his words affected everyone in the room, but none more than Sarah, who was watching from her post near the doorway. She had been trained to observe everything while remaining invisible, but Michael's statement hit her with unexpected force. She realized that she was witnessing something far more significant than a ceremonial visit. She was seeing the real power of the monarchy to inspire hope and create positive change in the world. What pushed Sarah over the emotional edge was what happened immediately after Michael's speech. The Queen, clearly moved by his words, stood up from her chair and did something unprecedented. She walked over to Michael's wheelchair, knelt down to his eye level, and gave him a gentle hug. It wasn't a formal royal gesture or a photo opportunity. It was a genuine moment of affection between two people who had found common ground in their desire to help others. The image of the Queen of England kneeling beside a disabled child's wheelchair while holding his handmade gift was so powerful that several people in the room began to tear up. Palace photographers captured the moment, but even they seemed to understand that they were documenting something truly special rather than just another royal event. Sarah felt her carefully maintained composure begin to crumble as she watched the scene unfold. The combination of Michael's selfless attitude, his touching gift, and the Queen's heartfelt response created an emotional perfect storm that her professional training couldn't withstand. Tears began to form in her eyes as she realized she was witnessing pure love and kindness in its most authentic form. The moment became even more poignant when other children in the group began to gather around Michael and the Queen, creating an impromptu group hug that included kids with various disabilities and challenges. They were laughing, crying, and sharing stories about their own dreams and hopes for the future. The formal royal setting melted away as the room filled with the sound of children's voices expressing joy and gratitude. Sarah's tears began to flow freely as she watched this extraordinary scene. She thought about her own reasons for joining the Queen's Guard and realized that moments like this were exactly what she had hoped to protect. These children represented the very best of humanity: resilience, hope, kindness, and the ability to find joy even in the face of serious challenges. As the ceremony concluded and the children began to leave with their families, Sarah remained at her post with tears still streaming down her cheeks. She made no effort to hide them, understanding that some moments are too important to mask with artificial composure. Her emotional response had been witnessed by several palace staff members, but instead of criticism, she received understanding nods and supportive smiles. The story of Sarah's tears, like James's emotional moment months earlier, quickly spread throughout the palace community. Staff members began to share these stories with friends and family, and eventually they reached local media outlets. The public's reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with people expressing admiration for guards who showed their humanity while still maintaining their professional duties. Michael's visit had accomplished something remarkable. It had reminded everyone present that behind the pageantry and protocol of royal life, there were real people doing meaningful work to make the world a better place. The Queen's willingness to break with tradition to show genuine affection for a disabled child, combined with the Guard's emotional responses, created a narrative about the power of authentic human connection that resonated far beyond the castle walls. For Sarah, the experience became a defining moment in her career and her life. She realized that showing emotion didn't make her weaker or less professional. Instead, it connected her more deeply to the purpose behind her service. The children she had watched that day would go on to achieve remarkable things in their lives. But they would always remember the Christmas when the Queen of England knelt down to hug a boy in a wheelchair, while a female guard stood nearby with tears of joy streaming down her face. The third remarkable incident occurred 6 months later during the spring garden parties at Buckingham Palace. These events were typically formal affairs where the royal family hosted hundreds of guests in the palace gardens, recognizing people who had made significant contributions to their communities. For the Queen's Guards, garden parties meant long hours of standing in the warm sunshine while maintaining perfect posture and stern expressions as thousands of people milled about the grounds. Lance Corporal David Thompson was experiencing his first garden party as a Queen's Guard, having only completed his training 2 months earlier. At just 21 years old, David was the youngest guard currently serving and felt enormous pressure to prove himself worthy of the position. He had grown up in London and had dreamed of becoming a Queen's Guard since childhood, inspired by watching the changing of the guard ceremony during school trips to the palace. David's background was different from many of his colleagues. He had grown up in a single-parent household after his father died in a car accident when David was only 5 years old. His mother, Maria, had worked multiple jobs to support David and his younger sister, often sacrificing her own needs to ensure her children had opportunities to succeed. David's decision to join the Queen's Guard was partly motivated by his desire to honor his mother's sacrifices and make her proud of the man he had become. The May Garden Party was particularly special because it was dedicated to honoring healthcare workers, teachers, and social workers who had gone above and beyond during recent challenging times. The guest list included nurses who had worked extra shifts during flu seasons, teachers who had started programs for disadvantaged students, and social workers who had helped families navigate difficult situations. These weren't celebrities or wealthy donors. These were ordinary people who had made extraordinary differences in their communities. David had been assigned to a post near the main refreshment area where he could observe most of the garden party activities while remaining properly positioned according to security protocols. The gardens looked spectacular, with perfectly manicured lawns, blooming flower beds, and elegant marquee tents set up to provide shade and serve afternoon tea to the guests. The atmosphere was celebratory but respectful, with soft classical music playing in the background as people mingled and shared stories about their work. As the afternoon progressed, David noticed a particular group of guests who stood out from the others. They were seated at a table near his position, and their conversation was more animated than the polite small talk typical of royal events. The group consisted of several women who appeared to be in their 40s and 50s, all wearing their best dresses and clearly excited to be at the palace. What caught David's attention was how they kept looking in his direction and whispering among themselves. What David didn't know was that this group consisted of 5 women who had worked together at the same inner-city elementary school for over 15 years. They had been invited to the garden party because of their innovative program that provided weekend meals for students who might not have adequate food at home. The program had started small, with the teachers using their own money to buy groceries, but had grown into a community-wide initiative that now fed hundreds of children every weekend. The leader of this group was Mrs. Patricia Williams, a 60-year-old teacher who had dedicated her entire career to working with disadvantaged children. She was known in her community as someone who never gave up on any student, no matter how challenging their circumstances might be. Her colleagues often joked that she had a magic touch with difficult kids, but the truth was that she simply believed every child deserved someone who cared about their success. Mrs. Williams had noticed David shortly after arriving at the garden party, and something about him had caught her attention. Perhaps it was his youth or the slight nervousness she detected beneath his professional demeanor, but she felt drawn to watch him as he carried out his duties. During her 40 years as a teacher, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people, especially young men who reminded her of the students she had taught over the decades. As the group enjoyed their afternoon tea and celebrated their recognition, Mrs. Williams shared a story that would soon change everything. She told her colleagues about a former student named David Thompson, a boy she had taught 15 years earlier, who had faced tremendous challenges at home but had never lost his determination to succeed. She described how this particular David had always been fascinated by the royal guards and had written a school essay about wanting to protect important people when he grew up. The conversation continued with Mrs. Williams, explaining how she had kept track of this former student over the years, watching proudly as he graduated from school, enrolled in military training, and eventually achieved his dream of becoming a Queen's Guard. She mentioned that she had seen his name in a recent newspaper article about new guards joining the royal household and had wondered if she might see him at the palace someday. One of her colleagues asked if she was certain that the young guard standing nearby was the same David from her story. Mrs. Williams studied David's face carefully for several minutes before nodding with growing excitement. Despite the formal uniform and the 15 years that had passed since she had last seen him, she was convinced that she was looking at her former student who had overcome so many obstacles to achieve his childhood dream. The group of teachers began to discuss what they should do with this information. Palace protocol clearly discouraged guests from attempting to speak with the guards, who were working and needed to maintain their professional composure. However, Mrs. Williams felt an overwhelming desire to let David know that she remembered him and was proud of his accomplishments. The maternal instinct that had driven her teaching career was now pushing her to break protocol for the sake of recognizing a former student's success. After much debate among her colleagues, Mrs. Williams made a decision that would create the third memorable moment of emotional breakthrough among the Queen's Guards. She approached David's position slowly and respectfully, making sure not to interfere with his duties or create any security concerns. When she was close enough for him to hear her clearly, she spoke in a voice filled with pride and emotion. "Excuse me?" she said softly. "I know you can't respond, but I believe you're David Thompson, and I was your teacher at Millfield Primary School many years ago. I just wanted you to know that Mrs. Williams is here, and she's incredibly proud of the man you've become." She paused for a moment before continuing. You wrote an essay about wanting to protect people, and look at you now. Your mother would be so proud." The words hit David like a lightning bolt. He had indeed been a student at Millfield Primary School, and Mrs. Williams had been his favorite teacher during one of the most difficult periods of his childhood. She had been the one adult who had consistently believed in him when others had written him off as a troublemaker from a broken home. Her classroom had been a safe haven where he could focus on learning instead of worrying about the problems waiting for him at home. David remembered the essay she had mentioned. It had been an assignment about future careers, and while other students had written about becoming doctors or lawyers, David had written about his fascination with the soldiers who protected the Queen. Mrs. Williams had been the only teacher who had taken his dreams seriously, even helping him research information about military careers and the requirements for becoming a Royal Guard. The flood of memories combined with the realization that his former teacher was standing right in front of him, having achieved her own remarkable success in education, created an emotional response that David's training couldn't contain. For the first time since taking his post that afternoon, his stern expression began to crack as a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Mrs. Williams noticed the change in his expression immediately and continued speaking, understanding that this might be her only opportunity to share her thoughts with him. She told him about following his progress over the years and about how she had used his story to inspire other students who faced similar challenges. She mentioned that his success had become a symbol of hope in their school community, proving that dreams could come true with hard work and determination. The more she spoke, the wider David's smile became. He was fighting a losing battle against the joy and pride welling up inside him as he listened to his former teacher's words. The strict training that had taught him to remain expressionless was no match for the overwhelming emotion of being recognized and celebrated by someone who had played such a crucial role in his development. Other garden party guests began to notice the interaction and the extraordinary sight of a Queen's Guard, with a genuine, uncontainable smile spreading across his face. Word spread quickly through the crowd that something special was happening, and people began to gather at a respectful distance to witness the scene unfolding between the teacher and her former student. Mrs. Williams concluded her impromptu speech by saying, "David, I want you to know that you represent the very best of what education can achieve. You prove that with the right support and determination, any child can grow up to protect and serve others. Thank you for making an old teacher's heart so proud." As she finished speaking, tears of joy began to flow down her cheeks, mirroring the emotion visible on David's face. By this point, David's smile had become so wide and genuine that it was impossible to miss. Palace staff and security personnel who witnessed the interaction immediately understood what was happening and made no move to intervene. They recognized that this was a moment of pure human connection that transcended normal protocol and deserved to be allowed to unfold naturally. The crowd that had gathered began to applaud softly as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Here was a Queen's Guard, trained to be stoic and unmovable, beaming with joy because his former teacher had recognized his achievement and expressed pride in his success. The scene represented everything positive about the relationship between educators and their students, showing how the influence of a caring teacher can last a lifetime. David maintained his post for the remaining hour of the garden party, but his smile never completely faded. Even as he tried to regain his professional composure, the joy of Mrs. Williams's recognition continued to shine through. Garden party guests who passed by his position commented to each other about the happy guard who seemed to radiate warmth and pride. After the event concluded, David was approached by his commanding officer, who had heard about the incident from multiple sources. Instead of reprimanding him for breaking protocol, the officer congratulated him on representing the human side of the Queen's Guard in such a positive way. The story of the guard who couldn't stop smiling quickly spread throughout the palace community and eventually reached the media, where it was celebrated as another example of the power of human connection to transcend formal boundaries. For Mrs. Williams and her colleagues, meeting David became the highlight of their garden party experience. They returned to their school with a story that would inspire students for years to come, proving that dedication and hard work could lead to extraordinary achievements. The recognition they had received for their own service was meaningful, but witnessing their former student's success while he protected the royal family added a layer of personal pride that made the honor even more special. David's smile that afternoon became symbolic of something larger than just one guard's emotional response. It represented the dreams of countless children who aspire to serve their country, the dedication of teachers who believe in their students' potential, and the power of recognition to validate years of hard work and sacrifice. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when the past and present collide in unexpected ways, reminding us that behind every uniform is a person with a story, dreams, and connections that shaped their journey to that moment. The three incidents involving James, Sarah, and David became legendary within the Queen's Guard community and beyond. They proved that showing genuine emotion and human connection didn't diminish the dignity or effectiveness of their service. Instead, it enhanced the public's understanding and appreciation of the real people who dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family. These moments of vulnerability and joy became powerful reminders that the strongest people are often those who aren't afraid to let their hearts show through their professional armor.